We're important globally because we are situated right in the middle of the coolest flora on the entire planet. The Cape is the richest non-tropical flora on the planet. So from that perspective, it's exceptionally interesting to botanists worldwide. We are literally at the epicenter of some of the most threatened landscapes in the Western Cape, which is a global biodiversity hotspot.
You know South Africa struggles with rhino and abalone poaching, but did you know that succulent smuggling is on the rise too?
Some they even ask, why do you care about these plants, you know? We say, no, it's very important because when you take out this plant from the wild, then you break down the ecosystem. When they come out of this garden, they come out this garden understanding what conservation is.
You know, it takes a lot of care to look after a plant.
We spent 25 years looking for this species and we could never find it. This species is red listed as critically rare, believed to be extinct.
There has been a greater appreciation of indigenous knowledge, systems, plant biodiversity, and how those interactions could potentially lead to new pharmaceutical discoveries.
When people understand things, they value them.
Our incredibly valuable and very, very rare conservation collections are not hidden away in some little back area that only the staff can access. You can come to this garden and you can see some of the rarest plants on the planet, many of which are not held in any other collection in the world. The garden was started in reality by Professor Vera Duffy, who merely by being a woman professor in life sciences at the time was an exceptional person. She was an extraordinary biologist and left us some of the best records we have of the local Stellenbosch landscape and plants. And she started in the early 20s, the garden, as a teaching resource right next to botany. And I think it was useful enough, quickly enough, that the university recognized that and invested in creating a formal teaching garden on the current site. And very shortly thereafter, the first curator was appointed, who was Dr. Hans Herrer. And you will see a tremendous number of succulent plants in our collections and within the Cape, named after him or named by him. He was an extraordinarily prolific plant explorer and succulent researcher. I grew up on the peninsula, so I'm very much embedded in the flora of the local sub-region. And I was doing botany as a backup to zoology, just to be a well-rounded zoologist. And in fact, fell in love with plants and realized that they were a far more fulfilling lifetime obsession. I was approached to apply for the position of curator of this botanical garden in 2018. So the first 2 years were really about understanding and consolidating before I really started making some changes.
I must say he's one of the best things that has happened to the garden in my career. Because he's a scientist, he understands the scientific value, and he's the right personality for the job because he built bridges with all of us.
Ek dink Donovan is 'n baie goeie mentor. Hy het baie kennis. Ek dink baie van my praktiese skills wat ek het ek geleer deur die tuin en meestal omdat hy daar was en omdat hy vir my vertel het hoe goed werk. So ja, ek dink dit is regtig baie inspirerend om saam met hom te werk. Want hy gee ook regtig baie om oor die goed wat hy doen.
Part of our job is to give people a lovely place to be and relax, and there's large parts of the garden that achieve that. But our primary job is to tell people about wild plants, the landscape, and to support the academic work in these landscapes. We are literally at the epicenter of some of the most threatened landscapes in the Western Cape, which is a global biodiversity hotspot. So We have regionally got exceptional numbers of threatened species, but particularly in our local landscape, within an hour's radius of Stellenbosch, there are an extraordinary number of plants that are on the brink of extinction and habitats that are on the brink of extinction. And that means that we are very well located to target those effectively. We are a relatively small garden with limited resources, so we have to be incredibly strategic about what we target. But here's a pretty example of just one species that's from our succulent landscape that is reflected in this arid house here. This is a plant called Geleë esterhazeni. It's a single site endemic from the Little Karoo, an area near McGregor. As far as we know right now, in the last survey, there were 6 plants left in the wild, and we now have approximately 8 pots this size that probably represent somewhere between 75 and 80% of the remaining living plants of this species on the planet. So we will be hand pollinating this plant to make sure that we have seed. That seed will be shared with our partners. We've already shared seed with Stellenbosch Gardens, and they've got a new population going. And that's one of many that we have in our collections where we have similar levels of threat and preservation value.
My name is Luyo, and my surname is Ngabile. I work at the Botanical Gardens. I'm very lucky to be able to learn all these wonderful things, the different roles from my colleagues who work in the Botanical Gardens along with me. I'm the only deaf staff member here, but I feel part of the team because we are all excited to be working in the Botanical Gardens.
Well, growing up in a family with a father that's a botanist and a mother that loved gardening, plants have always been an integral part of my life. Apparently, some of my first words in English were related to plants, such as the word flower. I'm Nokwanda Makunga, but a lot of people call me Nox, and I am in the Department of Botany and Zoology, and I'm a medicinal plant scientist. I've always loved plants, but I've also always loved the idea that science can be translated into beneficial goods for society. And so I've tried to marry those two worlds with each other. And so that translation of the research that happens in my particular environment into something that can actually sit on a shelf and be beneficial for health is very important to my philosophy. In South Africa, the exploitation of traditional medicines and the practice of indigenous knowledge systems was actually outlawed by the Witchcraft Act during the apartheid government. So that really speaks to a history that was suppressing people. There has been a greater appreciation of indigenous knowledge systems, plant biodiversity, and how those interactions could potentially lead to new pharmaceutical discoveries. We have a collection at the Botanical Gardens of one of the key species that we actually study in my laboratory. This happens to be Sciletium. We've collected different species of Sciletium and even different populations of the species of Sciletium. And the Botanical Gardens is now looking after that collection. So that allows us to be able to keep those ecotypes in conservation. And these are different species of Sciletium that are found throughout the Karoo and Namakwaland. And we've had this collection for the last 2 years. Nowadays, we are very much interested in Sciletium, and you get a variety of different products of Sciletium that are supposed to alleviate anxiety, that are really acting on the central nervous system, and that are even potentially important for neuropsychiatric applications.
I don't think you choose to study anything in such detail. I think it chooses you. I think it's a personality thing. In the front of my PhD, there's a quote by somebody I can't remember, but nature reveals herself to us in her finest detail. My name is Andrea. I'm a professor in botany at the University of Stellenbosch. I don't know how it happened that I dedicated my life to a little genus that's very unfairly known as a weed, and we all know it. I work on sorrels or Oxalis. Every gardener would know that there's this terrible crawling Oxalis, tiny little thing that is such an unfair judgment because the genus has got about 230 species in it, of which more than a third are red listed as extremely threatened and rare, and extremely dependent on water, so they are under severe threat. Oxalis and species that we haven't discovered yet is almost synonymous. In 2023, we had the most rain over the Oxalis distribution range since I started studying them 25 odd years ago. And we discovered 6 new species. We spent 25 years looking for this species and we could never find it. This species is red listed as critically rare, believed to be extinct in the red list of species. Rupert Koopman stumbled across this population and went out to the field and checked it, and it turned out to be this missing species. He was always out in the field scouring for interesting things, and he found this Oxalis, and when we saw these elongated seed pods, we immediately thought, well, this might be it. This grows in the Darling area. That whole part of the world has been transformed for grain agriculture. And there are just these little pockets of land that are sort of not completely flat, that have not got grain growing on it. And this farmer decided, like, well, then I'm just going to transform this useless piece of land into a dam. And lo and behold, that's the only known habitat of this species. So this population now survives in cultivation in Stellenbosch University Botanical Gardens. We're not just holding it there, we're actually working with it in order to ensure its long-term survival. We figured out its reproductive biology, how new plants are formed from seeds, but even a step before that, how we can do crossing experiments to successfully develop as many seeds as possible so that we can increase our stocks. And hopefully, ultimately, we can repopulate nature from this genetic pool that we're building up in the botanical gardens.
Hier in die tuin het hulle 'n conservation grade collection van die Oxalis fragilis, want daar's genoeg plante van verskillende genetiese agtergrond wat versamel is, en hulle is nou in die 2de of 3de generasie van handbestuiving ook om nog saad te kry.
I can't tell you how many papers I've written where somewhere in the paper I say, this has never been recorded in any other plant family. They do the most bizarre things imaginable biologically. They produce seeds that cannot go dormant. They can't dry out. So you can never build a seed bank. So if the climate changes and gets too dry, they can't produce seeds, they can't germinate their seeds, and they will ultimately go extinct. But what's fascinating about it is that this inability for seeds to be dried is an attribute that you associate with rainforests. And when I started scratching further, I realized, gee, what because Oxalis does it, and then a totally unrelated family, in fact, the family that Amanthus pimelos in, also does it. We unraveled it and realized that this flora is so super diverse and fascinating because it's evolved in response to the reliability of the Mediterranean winter rains. So Oxalis is just fantastic because it just gives us clues on how those evolutionary processes worked, and if we read those clues correctly, we can conserve them and others into the future.
So in hierdie area om Stellenbosch is van die oudste plase in Suid-Afrika. En hierdie areas is ook baie ryk, veral die laaglandgedeeltes, maar dit is ook waar jou ontwikkeling en ook waar mense wil bly, hulle wil by standvastige water wees en goeie grond. So dis nou 'n direkte konflik wat nou tussen jou skaarsplante en ontwikkeling ontstaan vir meer as 300 jaar. So met daai geskiedenis is daar nog steeds kolle wat oorgebly het. En nou is daar intensiewe druk op daai klein kolletjies wat oorgebly het. So ek het in Kuilsrivier groot geraak en die areas tussen Bottelery en Stellenbosch was totaal landelik en net boorde gewees toe ek klein was. En nou is al daai areas is nou onder huise en daar's malls en ander ontwikkelings daar.
Conservationists are worried that the Northern Cape Karoo is being targeted for its diversity of rare succulents. They believe that since 2019 and the ensuing pandemic, there's been an increasing demand for these succulents from countries in Asia, North America, and Europe. As authorities move in to confiscate thousands of poached plants, botanists and government are now working together to try and bring an end to this growing problem.
Illegal succulent trade is a very worrying, relatively new phenomenon at scale. But what we've seen post-COVID is an absolute explosion in poaching of some of our really rare and special succulents, and also ones that are relatively common but could certainly be decimated by poaching. These landscapes are dry. We're already struggling with some populations in decline from global warming, and removing the big adults that do most of the reproduction is an absolute disaster. So if you look in the beds behind me, you will see individuals that are probably up to 70 to 100 years old. But some of the really rare ones are being explicitly targeted, and we know that at least 3 species have been made extinct in the wild in the last 5 years. That entire haul came from a single find of 3 black bags in a culvert near the Northern Cape N7. Sandby's getting that quantity on a weekly or monthly basis every single month, and that's just the tip of the iceberg that's getting found. So we know that essentially, tons of these plants are going out annually, representing hundreds of thousands of individuals that might all be decades to many decades old.
I think one of the key mandates of the garden is to channel through some of the magic that we're finding in science in a simplified form and make it freely available and easily accessible for the public. If we can instill a sense of the importance of conservation into that next generation of young people, we are really investing in conservation into the future.
I fell in love with plants in my childhood because my grandfather was a person who actually loved to bring trees and then plant them. I've been working in this garden now it's 3 years now. I started as an intern, so I came for an internship and then I worked my way up, up to senior horticulturist. It's a very special place. One of also other strengths that we have is education, and then start to educate people exactly on what's happening. And the school kids that are coming. I mean, we have different school kids that are coming from Geleë. When they come out of this garden, they come out this garden understanding what conservation is.
The Botanical Gardens really is a wonderful space because it has plants from pretty much all over the world. And so that's an excellent teaching resource as well as a research tool.
The most important thing, I think, from the future of the garden is that the conservation work is at least maintained, but that the very vibrant and growing relationship with our academic departments continues to thrive and grow. You know, we really provide an incredible mutual resource in terms of both providing them with research and teaching material, but also some of our best interns are coming out of the university. They are getting skills that uniquely place them in the biodiversity sector. Whatever form our strategy takes, as long as it continues to leverage the advantages of us being right within a university environment, we should be on a good footing and in a good position to thrive going forward.
That's passion to me, you know, in terms of conservation and also research and education for the children and also for the public. Ngawo wonke amaxesha sizama into yokubana sizama uzonga sizigcine ukwenzela ubana isizukulwana sesizukulwana esizayo sibe nako uzibona nazo sibone uba ezi zizityalo zalapha kule Cape Region area okanye ezalapha eSouth Africa. Eyona nto endifuna uyenza mna as part of my history, abantu bakuthi bafunde banzi ngezi zityalo ezibaluleke kangaka.
It's wonderful, and every season you got something going that's new, and that I think is also pretty special.
So it's very important for us to not only look after the plants that we have, but especially the endangered species, you know. We need to teach people about that, create awareness.
Dit is my bekend, dit is my opgewonde, dit is my mooi. Dis deel van my legacy. Om 'n maatie te wees is nog 'n kontroversiële ding. Want ongelukkig is daar geweldig baie politiek wat daar ingemoet, maar ek is baie trots om 'n maatie te wees in 'n baie ryk geskiedenis en baie potensiaal. En ek probeer op my manier skool maak deur my mens wees. Ek voel tuis wanneer ek tuis. In English you can say it better, I feel at home.